This is going to be character design with Unreal Engine. The image up here is a project I made, a spec project, just for this talk. It's a cybernetic demon named the Face of Man. And so I kind of covered this already, so what are we talking about? We're talking about how to use Unreal Engine and 3D softwares with 2D image editing software to make images like this. So all three of these are images that I've created using ZBrush as my 3D tool into Unreal Engine, and then Photoshop for sort of a final composite and paint over pass. You don't have to use ZBrush in Photoshop. I work with FBXs and PNGs, so you could pretty much use any 3D editing tool. You could use Blender, you could use Maya, and similarly any 2D. The sort of glue that holds this together is Unreal Engine. And before I get into the details, I'm going to start with who am I? Who is this guy? My name is Connor Gartland. I have 12 years of experience working in VFX and animation. My first gig that I had, that was sort of like my big break, was at a company called Rooster Teeth. I did characters for them for a TV show called Red vs. Blue and another one called Ruby. After that, I was picked up by a company called Lightstorm Entertainment. They're known for making the Avatar sequels. Also, while with Lightstorm, I did Alita Battle Angel to help them finish that movie, and I've been working on Avatars ever since. My role on Avatar is what's called a virtual production stage operator. So if you've ever seen those fancy behind the scenes for like Mandalorian or whatever, where they have like the live action game environment mix, the stage operator is the person who runs the virtual environment.
Sorry.
Yes?
I think there were a bunch of people downstairs before.
Oh, okay. Well, I might wait a second then.
Yeah, I sort of let you know it was if their group and they were saying relatively people, so
Oh, well, there you go. I thought I was going to talk to an empty room. Okay, then maybe I'll hold off for a second. We can stay parked on this slide. So, show of hands, how many Unreal users in the room? Great, because some of these slides are like really technical, and if you don't know Unreal Engine, it's not going to make a lot of sense to you. Maybe I'll just back up real quick. There you go, you can just look at the pretty pictures. Oh yeah, here they come. Oh, way back. Come on in. Okay, seems like most people have made their way up from downstairs. Okay, so sorry for those of you who are here early, I'll just start over. So, what am I talking about today? I'm talking about how to use Unreal Engine as a tool to create character designs. These are 3 examples of designs that I made using this method. I basically started in ZBrush, go to Unreal as a rendering solution, and then you finish it in something like Photoshop for a final composite and paint over pass. Before I start to go into more detail, I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Connor Gartland. I've been working in VFX and animation for about 12 years now. My first job was at a company called Rooster Teeth. I did characters for a show called Red vs. Blue, and then again for a show called Ruby, which is the anime style show. After that, I currently work at a company called Lightstorm Entertainment. They're most known for their Avatar sequels, and I also did Alita Battle Angel while working at this current job. And my title for Lightstorm Entertainment is virtual production stage operator, which if you've seen like The Mandalorian behind the scenes where they have the LED wall, the stage operator is the person who runs the virtual environments. So at work, we have a Weta proprietary real-time engine called Gazebo, but I would say the sort of open market equivalent is something like Unreal Engine. And so yep, I already said that. This is a breakdown of Unreal as a tool for concept design. I want to stress this for anyone who is an asset artist. This is not a production pipeline, and this is not how to make in-game or animation-ready assets. In fact, if that's the type of work you do, you might be offended by some of the things I say today. And just for a brief overview I've broken it down into 3 categories. First, I talk a little bit about design, and then I get into specifics with what I call the exploration stage, or what you might call the first pass. And then the execution stage, which is the revision after receiving feedback from a director or a client. So design. To me, design is about 2 things. It's about function and communication. When people think of concept art, they usually think of pretty pictures or like cool robots and stuff. And while a lot of times that is the end result of concept art, that's not really the goal of concept art. Because concept artists work on movies, games, and animation. They're there to solve a problem. The story has a prop that it needs. It has a character that needs to do a certain thing, or the game needs a certain kind of vehicle. And a concept artist's role is to provide functional visual options to the production so they can sort of understand what these things look like. And I think it's important to emphasize options, because as artists, a lot of times we think of our favorite thing as the best thing, but a lot of times the piece that works the best in context of the production isn't your favorite piece of art. So you're just there to create as many options as the director needs, and then they select the art. And the bedrock of most designs, or the starting place, is a sketch. So what defines a sketch? I think in the modern world with social media, we've sort of lost scope of what a sketch is necessarily or isn't necessarily, because you'll see these really lovely piece of drafted work, beautifully rendered, and the artist will say, this is just a sketch I made. And so sketches can be a lot more simple than that. They can be doodles, napkin sketches, and I have a pretty impressive example of one of my own sketches to show you. So this is a real sketch that I did working on Avatar 2. The sketch is to sort of explore or explain the relationship between the character and the creature. And while it's not a lot to look at, this isn't the type of sketch that you go back to your office and you spend a whole morning working on. We have 15 seconds and we're on set trying to film, what does this thing look like? 15-second sketch. And the end result in the movie looks like that. So a sketch doesn't need to be this beautifully drafted thing to communicate. And in my head, a sketch is really communication. If you could say it better with words, you wouldn't need the sketch. So we use sketches, we use doodles to communicate things visually. Now, part of what a sketch could be justified as depends on your audience, because when you're communicating, audience is always important. In the case of this sketch, my audience was other artists. So I knew I didn't need to polish it or impress anybody. It was there as a thing to talk about, a thing to point at. Now, when I was working at Rooster Teeth, they were my client. I would not be caught dead showing them a sketch like that. And when I get to the next section, you'll see what I might have shown a client-type relationship. But artist to artist, we can be rough, we can be fast. You can do doodles, napkin sketches, call them what you will. And so, with that sort of preamble, this is my little humble sketchbook that I did for the character I designed for this talk. So, the sort of spec for this character is he's this kind of sci-fi demon character. And I wanted him to have a sort of human face, but like a beast body. I started a sketch here, and I liked the contrast between the face, the size of the horns, but I didn't like how animalistic he was. And I think I was really getting to something that I was going to pursue in this top left sketch here. But after just a really quick exploration, and this doesn't have to take more than 15, 20 minutes, I got this sort of idea here that he starts wearing his robe and then he reveals himself to be this sort of monster underneath. And that was enough of a direction for me to hop into ZBrush and start working on the 3D. So another question is, why design in 3D? So there's a couple of benefits to designing in 3D. I've worked with clients in the past who don't have great imaginations. If you show them an illustration, they say, no, but what does it look like in the movie? And working in 3D, working in Unreal Engine, you can approximate like a final render look very quickly. And it's easy for directors to understand, oh, hey, that looks like a VFX shot. Another thing that's great about working in 3D is ease of revision and modularity, meaning that you could create sort of a front view, and it's very easy to add or remove things. You don't have to start from scratch when making changes. You have a 3D asset, you have a scene, and you can tweak the asset, you can add to the asset. It makes that process easy, and it helps collaborating with the next stages in production, because if you do have a 3D sort of artifact at the end of the design, you can hand that to the asset department as a starting point for them, and you just sort of speed up the feedback loop between the art department and the asset department. This is a design of Canada, the character from Akira. So just as an example of where 3D design is helpful as a tool for speeding things up, I started with this design over here. And once I had that, I had the scene, I had the lighting. If I wanted to add the goggles from Act 1, there's a costume wardrobe change that could have been specified by a movie. Just model those goggles and pop them right in there. The render was already ready to go. Just hit the button again. Similarly, one of the things that can be very daunting when you're in an art review is you have this great front view. It looks awesome. You're proud of it. You're ready to show. And said, that looks great. What does the back look like? And if you're working in 2D, it's a non-trivial task to change camera angles. But in 3D, you turn them around, you chuck on that little logo on the back, and you got yourself a back render. That would have been obviously a lot more labor had the design been 2D. And another point, or another example to illustrate the strengths of working in 3D. So on the left here is sorry, is that your right? Or left? This is like a diagnostic clear shot where you can see the character fully. A lot of times you do a front view or a 3/4 view just as like to show all the information. And then the image on this side is a sort of mood piece. It's evocative of the genre and the story that's being told. And because this is the same asset, I simply moved, her hand. And 3D, you can do things like pose changes, camera angle changes, dramatic lighting changes quickly and easily. Especially lighting changes, those are really tough in 2D. Now what's the catch? So a lot of great stuff working in 3D. The downside is speed. 3D can take longer than 2D because there's technical hurdles present. Even opening files, rendering files can take more time than doing something in a more 2D traditional approach. So how do we make 3D renders quickly? We cut corners. You cheat. When I make this stuff, I'm doing no UVs, no topology, no hair. Don't tell the asset department. And I put an asterisk there because I do steal hair from MetaHuman and then paint over it to make it look like it's my own hair. And the other thing is you can use presets to speed up the process. So a lot of what I'm going to show you and the different steps that I use are something once you've set that up, you have an Unreal project file you can use, and you can use that same project over and over again. You've set it up, and now it's going to be really fast to put new characters in the same set and render again. Okay. So, with all that explained, this is what I call the exploration phase. Could be called the first pass, could be called thumbnailing. This is where I'm going to generate a lot of options for a client or director to react to and pick the pieces that they like. So here's another example project. So just so you can sort of see what the goal is or what this looks like. Over here, these are 4 renders I did out of Unreal, and those are the only 4 renders I did out of Unreal for this. All 6 of the other images are just composites of those 4 with things tweaked and changed in Photoshop. So what's cool about this process is because all 4 of those guys are rendered in the same lighting situation, they'll composite together really cleanly and easily without a lot of extra input. I'm really just masking between the 4 of them to make a variety of options. And if, you know, a director is like, oh, I like this guy, but give him an eyeball, it'd be as simple as just like copy, paste, you know? So the end result is all 6 of these look like I did all this work in 3D that I didn't do. And that's sort of just, you know, you want to have ideas quickly, you want to experiment, you want to end up with things that you didn't necessarily think of initially. Another example of this sort of exploration stage is this one. I only did these top 3 renders, I did these top 3 renders initially, and then on my thumbnails, I'm doing a lot of 2D work. I'm painting branches, I'm adding and removing details. And partway through that process, I stumble across more ideas. I'm like, oh, it'd be kind of cool if she had a veil. It'd be interesting if she had this headpiece. And since I already had my Unreal scene set up, I went back into ZBrush, I made those elements, and I rendered them out while I was working on the 2D pass. And once again, since your lighting situation is already the same as this, they composite really nicely together. And you can get a variety of options. So for the spec project for this one, The Face of Man, I didn't do the best job of documenting this, but this was my ZBrush project. I started with a simple head sculpt, sort of like angular, almost Loomis Male type look. I continued to sculpt, and I kit bashed on top some 3D mechanical bits. I really like kit bashing. And when I was in a decent enough place that I thought I could get started with my sort of thumbnailing pass, I threw a cloak on him and then headed to Unreal Engine. So a couple things to talk about before I get to Unreal Engine is Unreal is not designed to take dirty geometry. Unreal is expecting clean topology, clean UVs. So we're gonna have to change a couple of the default settings to get Unreal to like our dirty geo. So one of the main things is there's this remove degenerates. You don't want to remove degenerates. The degenerate faces are all over the place on these models because I'm using Dynamesh, I'm using decimated assets. Like nothing is clean. The other one that's kind of counterintuitive is the vertex color. So if you like doing polypaint or using vertex colors in your assets, Unreal by default is like, what are these vertex colors? I'm going to delete those. So you tell it replace, which is to say replace no vertex colors with the vertex colors from my file. It's very strange, but that's what I figured out. And lastly, there's a feature called import as dynamic. You want to make sure to check that because that'll come in handy when you want to rotate and manipulate your asset in the scene. Because if you don't import as dynamic, it's going to expect it to stay still and like not move. But when you're lighting and sort of playing with camera angles, you want to be able to move the asset around the scene. Okay, so here's a resource from the Unreal Asset Store. If you're like me, then once a month you download whatever free assets on the Asset Store, and then you never use it for the rest of your life. If you take one thing away from this whole talk, it's to get this Unreal scene. This is by far my favorite asset on the Asset Store. It's a MetaHuman lighting rig. And it gives you a couple different studio lighting setups with decent render options right out of the gate. And that's all it comes with. It's a very small file size. It doesn't even come with a MetaHuman, which is perfect for us. Yeah, so it's called the, what is that there? MetaHuman lighting. And that's one of the always free ones. It's not going anywhere. And as long as you're using Unreal Engine as like your tool, then this license is free. since we're creating images, that's what's considered linear media from a licensing standpoint. And at least at present, linear media is, you can just use all the Unreal resources and you don't owe them anything because you're not making a game. Another really great tool is what's called the mesh to MetaHuman. So you might recognize this. This was the sculpt that I showed you at the beginning of the section with the guy with the red light in his face. So mesh to MetaHuman, you create this thing called wrong button. This thing called a MetaHuman identity, and you add a mesh to it, and you run the MetaHuman identity solve. And if your mesh has 2 eyes and a mouth, it's usually pretty good at finding it, you know. And this is, I think, just the automated, right? And then you can. And this is something that's important because I've never seen this written down anywhere. I've never seen it in any videos explaining this tool. These hotkeys. Control, right click to add a point to the curve. Alt right click, remove a point from the curve. You'd be surprised how long it took me to figure that out. So if it doesn't match your mesh exactly or you want to tweak it, you kind of edit these guys like curves. And then this little like flask over here is whether it's going to take that into account when you run the identity solve. And it's sort of the circular process where you run the solve, it guesses what you want, and then you tweak the curve and you run it again. And eventually, you can turn this mesh into one of these guys. I did learn with this one, it's best to give it lips. I had a hard time with that. And if you look over here, you can see you can get some pretty cool stuff. I have a baboon MetaHuman. And once you have that solve looking kind of like this, you run the mesh to MetaHuman auto identity, and that should populate if you have your Unreal account. It'll populate on the MetaHuman website. Okay, and I have a video here. It's gonna play, maybe. There you go. Okay, so this is just me doing the steps that I just explained. Right, so here, this is the default settings I'm going through. Oh, this text is small. There's where I switch my vertex colors to replace. I turn off materials because I'm going to make my own materials. And I sped up this import. I don't have a supercomputer. It's going to yell at you a bunch of spam. You just close that. And this is the that MetaHuman lighting rig. So I'm going to tweak some stuff right off the bat because I want this to be sort of moody and dark. Once again, it starts you off in a really good place, so it's quite easy to tweak the lights like this. Next is the classic add a Cinecamera actor. I make 2 changes to the Cinecamera actor. One is I hate auto exposure because when you turn your lights brighter, it automatically changes the exposure, so I always turn that off. And the other thing is I'm going to turn off focus because for my purposes, I want everything to be in focus. And if I want to blur stuff, I'll just do that later. So there goes focus. I also might pick like a longer lens. I think if you want something cinematic, lenses usually in game engines are really wide, and like in movies it's probably going to be like a 40 to a 60 lens, whereas in video games it's probably like a 15. So if you just go longer lens, it's already kind of cinematic. The other thing is I'm just going to give myself like some kind of rim light, another trick to just make it look kind of movie-like. And then this is so with this sort of dirty geometry, I'm going to go grab some stuff off of Quixel. This process might be completely different in a couple of weeks because they're switching from Quixel to Fab, and I don't know what that's going to look like. I grab any MetaHuman because I just want the skin shader and the hair shader. Well, in this case, just the skin shader. And then I also grab just a generic set of materials, metal, cloth, things I can use. Another thing that I do here is I grab a decal. It'll come up in the video in a moment, but decals are indispensable with this workflow because it's kind of hard to get surface breakup when you don't have UVs. And decals let us work in sort of like world space aside from UVs because they're projection based. And here's me in the character blueprint. I'm just hooking up some materials. I apologize, this part takes longer than it should. And I'll add my MetaHuman shader there. So this is already getting us kind of in the ballpark where we want to be for this first pass. But like I said, it looks very clean, which makes it kind of feel very CG. So give him a second. He's working on it. Oh, another thing that I'll do in here is, if you notice, I just have this penetrating geometry of like the sort of metal piece and the face piece, because I know that I'm going to do this as two separate images and then mask them together later. So I'm going to kick out a screenshot of him just as a human face and then a screenshot of it just metal pieces. Yeah, so you can see, you can turn that off, and that's going to give you like a separate screenshot that you can play with. Once again, this is all about speed, so I'm kind of just like stumbling through what would be a normal like 3D process as quickly as possible to get results. So here's the decal. So like I said, it's difficult to get surface breakup without UV maps because most grunge maps and stuff depend on UVs. So I just throw in decals, and it can be any decal. I mean, this one literally looks kind of like poo. But I'm just going to place it and turn the opacity way down. Yeah, let's give it a... Right, so then you can just like, I think in this case I kill the albedo and then I turn the opacity down, and yeah, that'll give us basically what I'm going to show you in the next slide. And I'm just going to skip on from here. Right, so that was the process I used. I spent a little more time than in the video to make these guys, right? And then with these two images, I've generated most of these thumbnails just by combining elements and painting additional elements. I'll show you those Photoshop layers in a second. I also went back, like with the earlier example, I went back to Unreal Engine after starting this process to grab some extra pair of horns out of there. And here is using the same process, a different angle exploration. Here I was realizing that the front view, while it's fast to work in front view because you can mirror things and such, it doesn't really explain the shape of these horns. So I went for a different angle. I went for a different angle to play with the horns more. This is a slightly shorter video, but I'm just going to go through the Photoshop layers. I didn't record myself actually doing this. So that's like one layer, second layer, and you mask out the pieces you don't want. And then just regular painting on top. Cool, that's one variation. And then the next one I start from scratch, or not from scratch, but from the same source images. So base, you add a face on top. And then I did just a little bit of painting, play with the eyes and stuff. And I do a really shitty hair painting on there too. But for this pass, that's good enough. And then I like the guy in the bottom corner, so I basically copy paste him and then just go again, keep making up new ideas. There's a little photo bash in there. And same again. So you just keep adding to it and changing things. I like to work in one document so that if I have an idea, I can just like pause one thumbnail and hop to the next one. And the end result, it looks like I did all the effort to model and render all this stuff, when really it was just a couple of, like one or two images. Right, so if I was working with like a client relationship like I did with Rooster Teeth, I probably would present them something like this as the first pass. Using these shortcuts, you can kind of come up with this in a day. This doesn't take much more than a day's work to get something like this. Keeping in mind, most of what you're seeing here does not exist in 3D. This is just 2D stuff. And if the client picks one that they like, then we go into 3D. Which gets me to the third step, or the third category, I guess, the execution. So in this case, since I didn't have a client for this project, I asked my friend at the pub, and I said, which one do you like the best? And she said, I like the handsome one. I like when he's handsome. I'm like, okay. Because for me, my sensibility as an artist, my impression is like a demon. It's a monster. It should be scary and mean, like Nosferatu. And she's like, I like him pretty. I'm like, okay, pretty it is. So that's kind of what direction I started to move in. So this is a lot like the previous step, except we're going for a polished render at the end of the day, something higher resolution that you could hand off to a different department. And as with before, I'm going to look at some other examples. So this one is not a huge change from the render to the paint over, but there's some really important modifications I made here. So one was, obviously there's no fire in the render, and yeah, I could have made like a particle simulation, or I could have gotten like made some kind of asset. I'm like, no, just put a light there. I can add the fire later. So that light stands in for our fire, and other than that, I did a lot of sort of value adjustments. I noticed the background's kind of dark in the original render, so I brightened up the background. For composition purposes, I wanted to really play up the brightness of that fire and the contrast so that your eye's drawn to it. And then I also increased the brightness on her face, so then that's sort of the second point of compositional significance. So hopefully my design is that you'd see the fire first and then go to her gaze, and then explore the rest of the image where you see she's got these trees growing out of her. And with the background, you'll notice that in the original image, it's kind of hard to see the tree branches, but there's just enough contrast in the Photoshop comp that you can actually kind of feel that silhouette more. And a more dramatic example is this one. So I think this is a great example of what you can do after you're out of Unreal and when you're in 2D. This one, I think I was just trying to go really fast. I just had an idea in mind, and I did this in like an afternoon. But once again, I left a whole bunch of stuff out of the render because I knew I was going to come back and do this in 2D. So in this one, I have things like the keyboard. That's just a photograph of a keyboard. I knew I didn't want to model that too much time. Similarly, this is a good example of how you can take a MetaHuman hair as a base and turn it into something else, or at least embellish it. And yeah, so a couple other things I did in this image. I did a color grade because I don't usually think about colors until like the last thing. And you notice that in the original render, it's all just kind of like flesh tone and warm. And so in order to exaggerate or pull out the red of the hair, I've sort of done this greenish, almost matrixy color grade on the rest of it. So it's all yellows and greens, and then the hair pops more. Other things I did, just adding details and embellishments around, some photo bash, and you get yourself a pretty interesting final image. So to go back to the face of man, these are the steps I took after that initial pass. It's just a kind of a combination of additional sculpting, some more kit bashing with the mechanical pieces, and playing with the proportions. That this one here I was pretty happy with, and brought his cloak back, and that's going to go back into Unreal. The other thing I was thinking about was that initial sketch that I did, where he starts off as this almost regal, slender figure, and he sort of turns into a monster. So I had a literally unhinged idea to just take his head and pop that open to sell this idea as the monster. And in ZBrush, you can already kind of see it working, but I think I'm able to get a lot further with the way I light and render this. So before getting back into Unreal, I have another sort of side quest here. So, like I said, I don't bother with UVs because that's time consuming. So in order to do that, I do what I call hijacking Megascans for a triplanar shader. So these are all Megascan shaders on un-UV'd assets. So I'm going to explain in detail exactly how to get this node set up. for like 20 minutes. No, just kidding. There's this great website called blueprintue.com. And if you just search for TriPlanner, you'll probably find this. Thank you to user Millennial, who had the same problem that I did, but she solved it for me. The cool thing about blueprints in Unreal is you can copy and paste them as plain text. So if you create a material function in Unreal, you can literally just copy paste this in. No importing, it's just text. So then we take that, turn it into a material function, and this is the Megascans sort of base material, this MF tiling, and these 3 nodes are what I added. So I took this shader network, put that as a material function, and that material function is inserted here. And if you don't need any UV-based Megascans, you can just take that and plug it all the way in to over here. But I'm doing I've promoted it to what's called a parameter. So this gets a parameter that's a 1 or 0 called TriPlanner UV. And then that goes in with the original UV node, which means that now any Megascans in my file, I have a checkbox that's, do you want this Megascan to be in UV space, or do you want it to be in TriPlanner space? And like I said, I usually don't UV my work, so this is a very handy node to have. And then here's actually, are we running out of time? Anyways, here's another video. Same difference as before with the Cine Camera Actor. This mainly is to show what I use for my render settings. So Cine Camera Actor, I'm going to turn off the focus. So in order to render, we have to tell Unreal which camera to use, which means we need to create what's called a level sequence. This is also what you use for animation, but in this case, it's just for our camera. So you add a sequence actor, give it a name. In this case, I think I called it like demo. And then it creates this timeline, and you just have to drag and drop your camera into this timeline. And then there's like a clapperboard icon on sort of the top left of this timeline. Oh, sorry, I changed something else here. All right, this is so, because I'm doing a character, I'm using a portrait sort of ratio, which in this case is 4:5. Unreal by default is like assuming you're looking at like a 16:9 type cinematic viewport. So that's where you change that. And then this is from that same UE MetaHuman lighting project. It comes with some pretty good render presets. So I'm going to take the one that's in here called Still Ultra. And I'm going to change a couple of things here. So first is I'm going to end up using a JPEG, so I don't need the EXR. I'm also going to turn down some of the render quality just to make it a little faster. You wouldn't necessarily have to do this, it just saves time. And I'll add an output node for JPEG output. And then here's where you would set your output directory. Make sure you make a new folder for this, otherwise you'll be rendering on top of your old work, which nobody wants to do. And I had to set my resolution here again, because once again, Unreal assumes that you're making a movie or video game and wants that 16:9 resolution. And I'm once again going for 4:5. And I'm probably going to skip the rest of this one, but basically from there, I really just, where's that render button? Okay, so I'm going to add in different render passes, and those are all listed here. And you can like sort of preview those passes over here. It's going to have the same names, so you can see what render passes will be useful for you for painting and which ones won't be. So I wanted that one too. And yeah, once you have that, I'm just going to skip the rest of this. You can hit render local to render on your machine if you have a decent computer. But if you're on a potato, you might want to use render remote. They basically do the same thing. And the last note on the rendering is thinking about lighting. So cinematic lighting often obscures the subject or hides pieces of information. So the number one priority is to showcase the design and be clear of like what's in the image, what the person's looking at. The second priority is the genre and the mood. And so if you're doing something for horror, you might want to pick lighting choices evocative of that, so on and so forth. And here's the difference, sort of the delta between that render, or not that render, but a render of him and what the paint over looks like. This is a short one. So really, and this is a lot fewer layers than on the exploration pass because I'm way closer to what I wanted. You can see that basically I just have like crappy geometry that I didn't bother to fix when I was posing him. Fixing the eye the way that I wanted it to be. And this is all just really basic painting, like 2D painting on top. And in fact, it's not even very good 2D painting, but it gets the job done. There, I'm playing with the dodge and burn tool in Photoshop, which brightens and darkens areas. Because I want to brighten areas of compositional significance that I want to draw your eye to, and darken areas that I don't need you to see. In this case, I'm really just popping that face. I also took the change to lighten the background because I realized my composition was like dark gray on dark gray, and to lighten the background really brings out the silhouette more. And the last thing is a color correction. So like I said, I don't really think about colors till the end, and I end up with kind of boring color composition. So in this case, I'm adding a gradient map. That's this sort of purple-orange map. And then turning it way down and blending it so that it only shows up in the dark areas. So we're basically getting a sort of tonal value shift with the light and dark. It's kind of like free color theory in a way. Just a little cheat that I like to use. And so using basically those same layers on the different images, this was the render, and this is the final result. And yep, so that's kind of what we were making, and that's the face of man. Thank you for coming, and let's be friends. Add me. How are we on time? Do we still have time for questions? Okay, questions it is. Anybody? I usually don't rig because rigging becomes a really time-intensive process, especially when it comes to troubleshooting. I know how to rig, and I rigged things in the past, but usually when I'm doing this process and I start to rig, I end up wasting like a whole afternoon trying to figure out like an error. So I just posed it in ZBrush, just using really simple masking and like rotations. But you know, there's no reason you couldn't rig if that's faster for you, right?
Have you ever considered using a Revolution character creator to just have the basic rig and the base mesh to just get the per Z pose, the pose in ZBrush as well? I
actually have used that tool before. Like I like always trying new tools and new variations on this workflow. But usually it's all comes down to speed, and if I hit any hitches, then I kind of abandon it. So I was using that for a little bit. I kind of got frustrated with a couple of like sort of quirks of working with Reillusion, and I ended up just ditching it.
My question's more about like working in the industry itself. Like, how do you find balancing your like work and personal life, I guess, just like with the workload and then like, yeah.
Well, so my experience, and I think this is mostly experience working sort of more film-centric projects, is like the work is nonstop when it's busy, and then almost nothing when it's not busy. So it's kind of like that balance. I think when we get busy at my job, then I have no free time. But then there'll be other periods where I have just months of free time. So that's kind of where the balance comes in, I guess.
I just had a question about your import settings. Those, I've never seen them look like that. So what are you...
Oh,
doing
yeah.
there?
Let me just, can I get back? Can you skip me back to the beginning? Oh, let me go. Okay, so actually, thank you for bringing that up. I forgot to mention, so I specifically, one, I'm using FBXs. Two, I use import to level. I don't import it to the content browser. Because import to level gives you sort of two advantages. One is you won't have all these meshes just loose in your outliner. It puts it all into one little package that's a blueprint. The other thing is, yeah, it gives you these settings. And when you want to re-import it, since it's a blueprint, Unreal handles that really nicely.
So it kind of treats it like a prefab in a way.
Yeah, basically. And you get that for, it's really weird that it's not just like an import option, but the import to level just has a different behavior than importing it to the content browser.
Yeah. Cool.
Hi, thank you for the talk. How do you not get attached to like a certain variation that you did? Let's say you have like a creative director who is leaning towards like the other way with the character, but you have your favorite. How do you let go?
I feel like that's just an experience thing. I know a lot of really, really passionate younger artists really want to hold on and take ownership of everything that they work on. But the longer you've been at it, the more they're like, I don't like that, delete it. And like, you got it, boss. I think it's just time experience. At first I was like, no, this is the better version. You have to use the better version. And eventually they're like, I like the bad version. I'm like, it's your movie.
Thank you.
I think over here.
How long did they take you actively and passively to come up with a workflow like this? You know, like it probably takes many years of learning, but also when you actually actively trying to like conclude and form what you actually do to get to the same result, I guess, if that makes sense.
You're asking how long it took me to develop this workflow?
In a sense, yeah.
Yeah, I think, so I've been kind of making this kind of asset for a long time, or this kind of process, and I really didn't nail this workflow down this way until I decided to give this talk about it. But from the time I was like, I'm going to demonstrate this to having it as figured out as I do, it did take me like probably 5 or 6 months. From to just kind of like, I'm just messing around in Unreal Engine to like, no, these are the steps you can use.
I guess my question is, does this rough version ever enter the pipeline? Does it get to a rigging artist, or is it something that stops at your work and then you clean it up and that's when it gets to a rigging artist?
Yeah, so this is actually a good question. This goes into the sort of why design in 3D. Actually, yes, if you're working in 3D, even if the rough version never looks like the final version, it's always helpful to hand those things over to the asset department. And having worked in the asset department, I know what that, it's way better to have the thing that they kind of painted on than nothing. Even if you have to change it and fix it a lot, it's better than starting from zero, because you don't have to like re-figure out like the proportions and stuff. It's all kind of established. So even if my geometry is really underdeveloped, I would still hand that to the next artist.
Hi. How are you?
Hey.
I was curious about the Akira character example. I was looking at the jacket and I thought that it was really nice looking. I was thinking like, wow, like those UVs must be quite nice. But then you said that you don't use UVs. Were you using a triplanar material for that one?
Yeah, do I have that one nearby? Let's see. Oh. I have a version. Oh, yeah. So, yeah, it is basically triplanars for the leather bits. And this guy here, I painted this texture, like this sort of decal image in Photoshop, and that's like a projected on decal. Yeah, so the only thing that's UV'd here is his face, because it's a MetaHuman.
Yeah, makes sense. Awesome.
Yeah, and the other thing I did here that I didn't really mention is you can use vertex colors as like an ambient occlusion map. So there is actually an ambient occlusion here in the vertex colors. that kind of helps sell it. Yeah.
I'll make it quick. Do you make a new Unreal project for every single character, or do you have one mega project that you put everything into?
Nope, I have one project. Every character goes in the same project. Okay. And then every time you add, like for example, like I'll add a feature or like a shader, and now I could use that for the every other project coming later.
Hello. Okay. Hi. I want to ask, with new versions of Unreal coming out more often than ever, do you how often do you switch the versions that you work with?
Oh yeah, my rule of thumb for versions, because it will like lay waste to your project sometimes when you update. I'll never update versions while I'm working on a single project. So I haven't updated in probably for this. I haven't updated since I sort of like got the go ahead for this talk, because I didn't want to screw up my project that I needed to like screenshot and stuff. But now that I'm done this talk, I will probably update to the latest version.
Yeah, so my main interest in kind of that what you're doing is how do you handle AI in future? Do you think it will replace those kind of jobs for upcoming artists, or what about your job position compared to that?
Well, I think for me, I do see AI as a very powerful tool, and definitely like changing the landscape of how we do things. But I do think, in my opinion, and maybe it's sort of just like me coping, I do think that AI is good at making pretty images, but it's not as good at solving problems like I talked about in the beginning of the talk, right? Because you're like, hey, AI, make me this character from Akira. I bet you it's probably could make a better image than I could. But then you're like, oh, well, he's too tall. And it's just going to be like, how about this? And it's not necessarily going to hone in on the issue. Especially when it comes to like things, you'll get into a point working on something where they're like, this is perfect, don't change anything, but change his glove. And like this type of thing, I think AI is going to become a way to facilitate faster tools and better tools. I don't think there's going to be like a press button, get design. I don't think that's a thing.